Well, one of the things that I believe really strongly, and this isn't specifically a carnal theory, but it's kind of a theory of life, is that there's a radical power to personal storytelling. And that when we tell stories and we share stories with each other, and when we listen to other people's stories, we not only learn an awful lot about the world, but we discover information and tools we can use to change that world in exactly the ways that we need to.
What's your carnal theory?
Hello, everyone. I'm Abba, and today on Carnal Theory, we are honored with two guests. It's my pleasure to welcome Elizabeth Ann Wood. She is chair of the Department of Sociology, Anthropology, and Social Work at Nassau Community College in Garden City, New York, as well as the Senior Strategist for Woodhull Freedom Foundation, which is the human rights foundation working to protect sexual freedom as a fundamental human right. And for the focus of our conversation today, Elizabeth is the author of Bound, A Daughter, a Domme, and an End-of-Life Story. Elizabeth, welcome.
Thank you, Abba.
Also today, we are thrilled to have with us Rachel Music, who you may recognize from an interview on our sister podcast, Sex Talks with Diana. Rachel is an accomplished award-winning writer and actress, graduate of NYU and LIU, and also, for the primary context of today's conversation, the narrator of Elizabeth's work, Bound, A Daughter, a Domme, and an End-of-Life Story. Rachel, thank you so much for joining us as well.
Thrilled to be here.
Could you share the theories that you've brought for our consideration?
Absolutely. So I have carnal theories about all kinds of things. The one that I really want to focus on today, though, links sexuality and illness and caregiving and mortality, which is a pretty challenging combination of things to link. So it has three parts. And part number one is that sexuality is not erased by illness or aging. Part number two is that we don't give up our human right to sexual freedom in exchange for healthcare or caregiving services. And then the last piece is maybe the most challenging, and that is that facing our mortality allows us to live our freest and fullest lives, including sexually.
Rachel, could you share the theory that you've brought also for our reflection?
Absolutely. Well, just like Elizabeth, I also have carnal theories of Bound, and I wanted to be here especially to speak to Bound and the experiences I had with it. And so the all-encompassing theory that I've been trying to live lately is that sexuality cannot and absolutely should not be viewed as a static, standalone state of being. It can't be viewed as in a vacuum. Instead, you should be able to view it from any sort of analytical lens. And conversely, there are plenty of areas of study that could use a sexually informed or a sexuality informed or an erotically informed lens. So you could consider it, the semiotics of the erotic. I'm very interested in parsing that out, and it's so beautifully done in this book. You're looking at it sociologically, you're looking at it emotionally, you're looking at it as a daughter, as a mental health advocate, as a family member, and so that's really what drew me to the book, and it's been informing my thought processes ever since.
Elizabeth, I'm curious about your reaction to that.
Well, it's obviously something that I feel strongly about myself, that, when I wrote this, one of the reasons I wrote it the way I did is because I thought you can't talk about caregiving without talking about sexuality. And you can't talk about sexuality as if it is this separate part of our lives that doesn't intersect with every other part of our lives. I'm really interested to hear what it was like for Rachel as she was reading it, because the experience of listening to Rachel read it for me was incredibly profound. But to hear that it had an impact on her like that is both gratifying, but also pings all my curiosities.
Yeah. So Rachel, what drew you to this work, and what was the process like?
Elizabeth and I almost did not end up working together. I consider this one of the great examples of the universe for rewarding good behavior. I was my mentor and the head of my MFA program. His wife is a very accomplished actress who wanted to get into audiobooks. And so I love this work. I consider it the best job in the world, honestly. And I was showing her here is where you can audition for some audiobooks. And I see one and I almost feel guilty because I go, oh, Kate, this isn't for you. This is for me. But what you could do in this situation is email the author and say, hello, my name is Rachel Music. I'm terribly interested in this manuscript because not only was my mother in hospice, but I was a sex worker as well in BDSM. And I am fascinated by sociology and anthropology, which I studied at NYU. And I have my own touchy relationship with my mother. I would absolutely love to audition. And Elizabeth generously said, I'm basically done. I wasn't going to see any more or listen to any more options. So I, as soon as I was finished with my lesson with this lovely woman, Kate, I went home and went, oh my gosh. I look at the audition script and I am captured. When I am not narrating, I'm a writer, have been as long as I can remember. And it's, it's so well written. It's so engagingly written right off the bat. And it's also written in a very a conversational and an intimate way where there's nothing cold or staid. And even when you can get some jargon thrown in there, Elizabeth manages to really make it feel as if she's speaking right to you. And that's the kind of work that is so gratifying to do. And luckily, our interests aligned. And working on this book started as a wonderful experience and happenstance. And as I got into the book, I was not prepared for the emotional journey that I went on. In order to do the book justice, I really wanted to, inhabit the emotional places.
Oh, thank you. You brought up boundaries several times then. And one of the through line themes that stood out for me, at least, I don't know if it's intentional, but it was this underlining of consent in various ways. And a few of the ways that stand out to me the most, it's the consent and / boundaries relationship between your mother and her lovers. Consent and boundaries, which you go into detail about, and I'd like to go into that a little bit in a second. Consent and boundaries between you and your mother, and not just as advocate and mother, daughter and mother, but the two of you share, or she shares a lot of her sexual experiences with you. You're her sexual advocate in a lot of ways before you end up being her healthcare advocate in my eyes. And then there's this consent story of fucking hospitals. And there's a point where you really underline it, or maybe just, what am I saying? You underline it all the time, but where it really stood out to me, your mother's had a number of rectal insertions for a procedure that she needs to have. And there's been several of them, and she is really not having a good time about it, as one might imagine. And you reflect how she has yet to receive meaningful consent on this. Nobody asks her, might she have any trauma that might make this procedure be more difficult for her? Or is there just anything that she might want to tell the healthcare workers before this procedure that might make it a little easier? And so I see this thread of consent throughout, and it showcases for me just how lacking of consent throughout society. And it's an issue.
It's a big issue. And I don't think it's restricted to healthcare. I think it is pervasive, right? And one of the things that I reflected on during the experience, and then again in the writing, was that doctors and nurses, for example, could have so much to learn from sex educators about consent. And not just any sex educators, but particularly sex educators involved in educating about kink, I think. because those are probably some of the most well-developed consent practices out there, and ironically, the most parallel in terms of situational needs with somebody in the hospital. But it is pervasive. We have the same kind of consent problems when we tell kids, "Oh, go give grandma a kiss," and the kid doesn't want to. No, you must. Why must I? We're just not good at it. We want to assume too much, too often. Right. Yeah. But the story about those rectal tubes, that story is so powerful for a couple of reasons. And the consent reason is one. But the other thing that I think is kind of oddly charming about a story that involves a really miserable experience of an infection that causes just terrible, terrible diarrhea all the time is that my mother's kink experience allowed her to reframe some of this in a way that, at least in her mind, I think, made it a little easier to deal with. So, for instance, she always called the rectal tube, which was intended, it's just a plastic tube that they stick up your ass, to try to drain the diarrhea out away from your skin so it's not irritating you all the time. And lots of people don't want things put up their butts. But in any case, in her frame of reference, and she was a little bit unclear in general because of the illness, but from her frame of reference, it was a butt plug.
Yeah. Which
was a lot more familiar and thus a lot less scary. Now, it was still very uncomfortable. It was painful for her. She shouldn't have had so many of them, and there's one piece of that story where the nurse and I actually agree that we are not doing another one. If this one comes out, no more. And still she ends up with another one, because from the nurse's perspective, it wasn't the same.
Elizabeth, it's not just in healthcare and there's another side of it, but it is pervasive. And there's so many conversations around death and aging and butt stuff and poop, that we don't want to have. But the takeaway that I got from this documentary is that if you get women together and talking, magic happens, miracles happen. Suddenly we talk about, and it's just, I love that these silences are being lifted.
Well, one of the things that I believe really strongly, and this isn't specifically a carnal theory, but it's kind of a theory of life, is that there's a radical power to personal storytelling. And that when we tell stories and we share stories with each other, and when we listen to other people's stories, we not only learn an awful lot about the world, but we discover information and tools we can use to change that world in exactly the ways that we need to. But we can't do it unless we share the stories.
This larger idea, and then I'd like to loop it back for a second, specifically about your mother's BDSM, but we enter hospitals against our consent. Mm-hmm. And then you say, and then once we're there and we have to sign all these papers to get it back. Mm-hmm. That disgustingly stood out to me. Yeah. And I wondered if you had any feedback or thoughts, because you were the one really having to navigate all of this, like constantly going in and out of hospitals and renegotiating what the doctors were doing and maybe communicating to you or maybe not.
Yeah. So one of the things that I really noticed through my mother's illness is that, of course, nobody wants to be sick and go to the hospital. So while we do it because we, absent being committed for your own good against your wishes, most of us do decide, okay, I'm really sick, I have to go to the hospital. So in that sense, we consent, but we're not consenting freely, really. We're being coerced in that case by our bodies, right? Our bodies are coercing us. And then we become captives in this system that in order to receive any treatment, we need to consent. And so there's another level of coercion there. We don't get to really pick and choose what to consent to. Consent forms tend to be very blanket forms. You consent to the treatment or you don't. You don't consent to part A and not part B. And once you've signed the form, if in fact it is an issue where there is a form to sign, it's kind of like a one-time deal. And if you talk to sex educators about consent and sexual interaction, there's a focus on chronically checking in, coming back to the idea that consent can be withdrawn at any point, that consent can be renegotiated. And that is absolutely not true. or it doesn't feel true in the healthcare sense. Consent in the healthcare situation is very much a kind of rudimentary, relatively meaningless kind of thing. And then separate from the forms, when you're talking about nurses or aides or doctors coming into a room and interacting with you, it would be impossible for them to achieve meaningful consent frequently, because frequently they're not looking at you as an entire person. They're looking at you as, the kidney cancer in room 320 or something like that. Now, I have to say, like, my mom was in an amazingly good hospital and was treated by really caring nurses and doctors and aides particularly. I mean, I cannot say enough about the amazing nursing assistants and aides that took care of her. And they saw her. It's like the lower your level on the hierarchy, the more directly connected you are to the patient and the more likely you are to see the patient as a whole person. So there's a really charming story in there about an aide talking to my mom about a tattoo that she has. And it's a really human interaction, and it's different from what her interactions with doctors would have been like. It's like the healthcare system is so bureaucratic and so compartmentalized that even the doctors aren't whole people. They have more status and more power, but they're still, has renal been in? Or have you seen cardiology today? Like, it doesn't matter which cardiology person that you saw. So when you remove the humanity from the people who are moving through the system, then it's hard to imagine that you could have something like meaningful consent.
I wanted to make sure that both of you have an opportunity to speak about what you'd like readers to take away or listeners to take away. So I was hoping, Elizabeth, if you could give a little bit of what,
Sure.
Of your writing of the book, what you'd like readers to be able to take away. And then Rachel, maybe a little differently from the listening side.
So one of the most important messages to me in this book is that we are all going to either be caregivers or need caregivers at some point in our lives. Almost all of us are going to be in one or the other, if not both of those situations. And so there are some things I think I learned from going through this with my mom that I hope people take away from this. And one is that the person who needs care has a whole life that might include pieces that the caregiver or the healthcare people don't know about or haven't heard about before. It's easy to make assumptions that we know what people want or need. And it's really important to stop and ask questions and listen. And if you're the person who needs care, it's important to be able to share enough about your life that people are able to give you the care that you really need, which goes well beyond whatever kind of health crisis or issue you're currently dealing with. And this is not an easy thing to ask of people, all in all. None of this that I'm talking about. And so the main kind of really big umbrella lesson I would hope people take away is this is all going to be so much easier if we can talk about it before we're sick. If we can talk about it before we really need to, because that's when we have more freedom. That's when we're not in that coercive situation. So the more we can be open about sexuality and about mortality. And I really do think like sex and death are two sides of many of the same conversations. If we can be open about our mortality, if we can be open about our sexuality, we are going to get better care and be able to provide better care.
Rachel, I'd love your thoughts on the listener's experience, if there's takeaways that you have.
If folks are listeners as opposed to readers, I hope that their takeaway is similar to what mine was. And like I said from the beginning, it was very clear that Elizabeth and I were kindred spirits. We're both elder daughters with boundary issue moms and compartmentalizers and caretakers and mediators. And even with all of those similarities, one huge point of jealousy, in fact, is something that you just brought up, Elizabeth, is the shamelessness.
Yeah.
I read this chapter about how supportive your mother was during your own quest for contraception and your sexual awakenings and all that entailed, and was so jealous. That is diametrically opposed to my upbringing, which was nothing but stigma. And here is the pill, but it is for your cycles. It is not for sex. Don't you dare. I think that it comes back to this idea of body autonomy and I think that doctors have a lot to respect, and I respect their time and effort and expertise, but they so often fall short in bedside manner and in issues of agency and in issues of humanity. And probably it's systemic. It's not the fault of the individual doctor. And I think that there is a future where we meet them halfway, and whether it's knowing, well, my cycle is this, and this is how ovulation affects my body, or if it's this is the type of dialysis I would prefer for my own lifestyle. Bringing solutions and actively taking it. I think of it as nobody likes help me. Nobody likes an open hand, but people do like puzzles, and I think that doctors are much the same. So all this to say, I have so much in common with Elizabeth, but even if you have one, you'll find one thing listening to it, even if your background is wildly, radically different. And there's so much hope and optimism packed into something that can often feel like you could have just done a dress down of the entire, health system, and it would be warranted. But you manage to offer solutions, and I think that's so fantastic and something that's very sorely needed right now.
And in an entertaining and relatable way.
Thank you.
It's a lovely story.
Thank you.
It's a lovely story, really, and it's well performed as well, Rachel. Truly,
it is incredibly well performed.
Yeah.
You're very sweet. Thank you.
Elizabeth, thank you for your work. Rachel, thank you for your work. I look forward to talking again.
Thank you, Emma.
Our pleasure.